My name is Mark Henry. I'm the Chief Academic Officer and Senior Vice President at the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, a nonprofit in Wilmington, Delaware, that works nationwide with college students and faculty to educate for liberty. We have very, very broad interests. We do programming on everything from political philosophy to the history of the American founding, to ancient philosophy, to literature. And I myself, my training is in political philosophy, and so I'm a little bit tone deaf in literature. I sometimes pester my literary friends with the question, well, what is literature for? What does it do? And their response is, well, it delights and instructs, to use an old chestnut there. And I think that's true and important. And ISI is committed to advancing liberal learning in a very broad sense. And in recent years, we've been drawing closer to the Council on National Literatures, which is a program, an organization that seeks to do justice to the literature in relationship to a national experience. In a way, it's an implicit critique of a kind of facile cosmopolitanism in literature, a search for a world literature that sort of floats above actual national experience. One of the people who was to have been here today, but informed me yesterday could not be, was William Rice from the National Endowment for the Humanities. And he said that he thought this was a very promising initiative, and he called it multiculturalism the hard way, to actually do the work of understanding cultures through their characteristic literary production. And so it seems to me that if there is something to learn in multiculturalism, it would be in this hard way. And so that's something of what we're on about today. And our program will start with some introductory remarks from Anne Paolucci, who is the president of the Council on National Literatures, and a literary figure in her own right, the author of short stories, plays, poetry, a bit, and also many works of criticism. And she has been the president of the Council on National Literatures for nearly its whole existence, I guess. Is that right, Anne? The whole existence of the Council on National Literatures, have you been president?
Started when, in 75.
1975. And so she's going to share with us some remarks on what the project is, and then we will turn to our two main speakers for the day.
Thank you. I've got it all here. Thank you, Mark. Well, as Mark Henry explained already, CNL started in 1975, and it was a decision I had to make on my own because, in a strange way, what became the major series, Review of National Literatures, and I'll speak about that in a moment, actually started in 1970. It was a project that I was on the presidential staff at St. John's University in New York, and the president wanted us to have a new special project. And I thought to myself, another publication is just another publication. And with the global mandate that was then beginning to take root, and many of the things I had encountered in my travels, I'd been to Australia for 6 months and elsewhere, and I decided that there are literatures out there that deserve attention and are not getting it. Since then, and you probably have experienced this in some way, since then, on many, many campuses, and if you look at the MLA directory too, I think most of us belong to the MLA, you'll find that in many colleges and universities you have clusters, actual departments in some cases, and clusters of literatures like Scandinavian studies And on the West Coast, the University of Washington in Seattle even has courses in Thai literature. Well, of course, whether you teach Thai literature at Harvard, you might, but you have to teach English literature first. You know? It's one of those things that it's an exotic interest. Well, you have a lot of these exotic interests, but they're not really exotic. If you take seriously the mandate to give attention to many of the literatures, and I have called them in my work emergent and neglected Scandinavian literatures, for example, are not in the traditional canon of comparative literary studies, of which I partake as well. We know what the core there is, and it has a tradition from the Greco-Roman right down to Europe, and that means French, German, Italian, Spanish, basically, and English, of course. Russian has come into it in some way. But everything else is outside that. So you have today many professors on the campuses introducing other authors, Ivo Andrić, Rao in India. By the way, well, I'll get to that in a minute. You have these wonderful authors who are being absolutely neglected by the largest segment of the literary world, which is of literary studies, which is America and Britain, right? And so how do we do that? And my perverse, because who was listening to me at that point, even today, Gillespie still calls it a pioneer effort. And what I chose to do was to put out a series that would gain prominence all over the world. We have wonderful reviews on every one of these issues that came out over the years. 32 years I've been doing this. And the books were very carefully thought out. Nothing was left to chance. I would choose a special editor who was the expert in that field, and he and I together would choose 8 to 10 people, experts, in certain areas that we wanted covered. And these people would write an article of X number of pages. We'd give very specific instructions. And those articles became overviews of the history of that literature. You understand how important these books are. You won't find them anywhere else. You'll find, as someone said in one of the reviews, there are plenty of books on Black Africa, for example, but not like this one, because this one really has mapped the various areas that needed to be covered, and we tried to find the experts to cover them. So you see how different this series was from the very beginning, and it remained that way. Sometimes we went back to an ordinary, the familiar subjects like Shakespeare and England. Well, for an obvious reason, because the point of view there was very different. Or something neglected in a familiar literature. For example, the France of Claudel. Who knows Claudel today? I remember saying to a friend of mine who said, Anne, you must do that. I said, but I don't particularly like Claudel either. And then I got to Henri Peer, you know, the great Henri Peer, who was one of the great comparatists of the 20th century. Yale, Sterling professor at Yale, and then he moved to the Graduate Center at City University. And I called him with trepidation because I knew how busy he was. He died, of course, now he's dead. But at that time I called him and I said, I'm thinking of doing the France of Claudel. And he said exactly what I had said. He said, yes, but I don't like him. I said, yes, but you know, as someone said, it's an era that is fast disappearing. And I think it deserves to be, and that's the way you should look at your studies, those of you who are still students. Even if you don't like something, especially if you don't like something, try to get to it anyway. You'd be surprised what comes out of those experiments. Anyway, what happened, I let it go. I said, well, and I called him back at one point. I said, would you help me with this and that? And he got me writers from France. He actually translated articles for that. I don't think it's down here, the France of Claudel. And finally I called him back and I said, you know, Professor Peer, you really should take up my offer because, and by the way, I wasn't paying anybody anything. I never paid anybody for any of these articles. I said, because you've done all the work already. And with that, he took it on. and he became the special editor. We had, every issue has a special editor who's an expert in the field, and of course he knew French literature backwards, including Claudel, whom he said he didn't like. Anyway, it turned out to be a major issue because we looked at a subject in a familiar context, but from a new perspective. So that was the kind of work we did. With the emergent literatures, of course, the Black Africa issue got rave reviews everywhere. And the Yugoslav issue, the India issue carries an article by my husband and me on the vernaculars of Dante and the 16 languages of India. It was a first. It got rave reviews on the literary page of the India Times. So I'm just telling you a bit about this to tell you how important this work is. And of course, it's still going on. We have today, a friend of mine, I don't know if he's still around, but I remember he loved Greek poetry, Greek modern poetry. And he made sure, I don't know if he integrated it into a course he was giving or created a new course on Greek modern literature, Greek poetry. Well, when he went, the course went. You see what I'm getting at? We have to establish roots for this kind of study, the same kind of roots that we have already in place for comparative literary studies, which is a real name for comparative literature. There is no such thing as comparative literature. There's French literature, Italian, and so on. But comparative literary studies, and I like to call this multi-comparative literary studies, what we're doing. Now, let me just go back because my time is limited, and I have maybe 5 more minutes. In 2001, I ended the series of RNL for a number of reasons. It came to about 32 volumes. That and the companion series, which began in '85, which I don't have down here, the CNL World Report, which became a forum for discussion of the kinds of topics, the kinds of problems even, that this kind of project faces. How do you integrate this into a national program? What do you put in, what do you put out? It's hard enough, you know, with courses. If you have a course on the novel, who do you push out to get Ivo Andrić in there? Or a Rao? You know, India has many, many writers, excellent writers, who write in English. Why? Because India uses English as its official language. Why? Because of the British invasion. This was one of the very positive outcomes of the British stay in India. And the Indians were intelligent enough to take the positive that resulted from that occupation of the British, the language. And to this day, English, almost everyone from India who comes here speaks English, as you know. You probably have encountered them. And that is very important. And I'll tell you why. Because if you're trying to orchestrate some kind of program, and I have it in my head, I have also put it down on paper, it could be done. Some experiments in areas like the tri-state area, where you have at NYU a Middle East institute that has a vertical structure. By that I mean every country is represented in every aspect of culture, literature, politics, religion, right? You have at Columbia a very good concentration of Eastern studies with, he's retired now, but the great William de Bary in Chinese and Japanese. I think it was mostly Chinese in his case. And I remember taking 2 Chinese seminars, 2 summers with him. And I loved the history. It was more history than anything else, and I loved it. And I forgot now what Princeton has. They have an institute of some kind. You see what I'm getting at? Instead of teaching in one place, of course this is a departure, and maybe it sounds way out, you know, but it can be done with the cooperation of the colleges and universities. You can have, instead of teaching in one place, 1 course or 3 courses, you could be teaching, let's say in an area like the tri-state area, your specialty in Middle East studies in 3 universities, right? in a program that is aimed at introducing some of these literatures into the mainstream? Why do you have to go into Middle East studies to get that material? Why can't we have it in comparative literary studies? So that's been my aim from the beginning. With that in mind, and this is my closing statement, with that in mind, in 2001, I ended the series, which had done remarkably well, and turned my attention to other things. And when I came into contact with ISI, I thought this was a very good outlet for presenting or working together to present the kinds of things that we're talking about. So I welcome the possibility of working with ISI on this, and this is my last word, what I foresee and would like to see develop now in this first important conference, even though we happy few, nonetheless it's an important conference because there are academics here, teachers and students, who can promote this kind of thing or make it happen in the classroom in some way. In your own courses, you can introduce new materials. Whatever you happen to be interested in, tell others about it, promote panels and discussions, invite people to lecture on this or that. I have very good people still accessible to me. John Gillespie in Japanese studies, for example, he talked to my DA students at St. John's once, and I remember he's an expert in drama, in Japanese drama. And I remember his talking about the silences in, I forgot it was the kabuki or the no drama, and 20-minute silences. Can you imagine sitting in a theater for 20 minutes and nothing happening? Way off our track, right? How do we get adjusted to that? These are the things that we face, the problems we face of communication when we go out and look at some of these other literatures. But we have to do it. It's in the future. It has to be done. And I think we're on the avant-garde still. And John Gillespie, who's been the head of the International Comparative Lit Association for many years, good friend of mine, who urged me to write this, prepare the samplers. We have 3 samplers in addition to the books, where we collected the articles, some articles from the entire series and put them in different books. And he wrote the introduction to the one on the emergent literatures. And I think you should really have that. It's a wonderful book. And he still says it's a pioneer effort because so little is being done. We have all the switches ready. All you have to do is turn it on. And that can't be done yet. That can't be done until we're all in some kind of cohesive organization that can address the problems. They're not easy to solve, as you can see, but one of the easy clusters would be the English-speaking literatures. And you know what they are? The former Commonwealth. Wonderful writers in Australia, Barbara Boynton and others. Wonderful writers in India, in English, no translation. In Canada. You know, I think in Malaysia you have some English stuff. And of course in Britain itself. So we have a cluster already to go. If you want to think about it, that would be the place to begin. India is a fabulous country and it has so much in English. So with that, you can start revising courses, introducing new courses, experimental courses, whatever. And the goal of CNL at this point in its history, and it has a long history, at this point, through the the cooperative effort of ISI and CNL, would be to encourage this kind of work on the campuses. So that's my last word and my last encouragement to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. Our first paper today will be by Bainard Cowan of the University of Dallas. Bainard Cowan is currently the Louise Cowan Chair of Literature at the University of Dallas, which is named for his mother. Bainard's BA is from the University of Dallas, So you see it's a very incestuous place down there. However, for 30 years, he was professor of literature at Louisiana State University. His PhD is from Yale. He has a book on Herman Melville's Moby Dick. He has 3 collected edited volumes of essays. He's written on many topics, including the classics, but focuses primarily on comparative literature and on American literature. And today he will speak to us about Edouard Glissant and the persistence of national literature. Bainard Cowan.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Professor Paolucci, as well. Let me make a quick notation as to time. I want to run over. What is the relation of literature to the nation out of which it comes? And what is the relation of national literatures to the culture of the world? These are the concerns that mark the study of national literatures as a field that might change our understanding of literary production and the relation of literature to culture. The very notion of an international literature might not exist without the internal exchanges that mark a people's dialogue of letters with itself. In fact, it might be accurate to say that the monumental authors of world literature have been simply the best writers of their national tongues. The 2 categories are far from exclusive. The larger arises out of the smaller, as seems logical. But driving this orderly arrangement is the paradoxical truth that for poetry and the arts, the most universal truths are not the most abstractly and generally formulated, but rather those that are most grounded in the specific experience of a place and a community. One is tempted to ask whether, without love of a nation, love of the world as a whole can be conceived of as anything more than an abstract sentiment. Well, the topic is vast, of course, and any honest assessment of national literatures would have to begin with a long list of masterworks whose presence would prove so preoccupying that the questions we are pursuing, the relation of literature to the nation and of national literature to the world, would fade away and lose their thread. For this reason, I've chosen to talk about some observable patterns in some contemporary literature with reference to 2 earlier international relationships that I think prove paradigmatic for us. And then I want to end by presenting the considerations of an important contemporary writer on the outlook for these questions today. One might begin by examining those instances of the influence of a world style on the development of national consciousness and literature. In teaching a graduate course on magical realism at Louisiana State University, for instance, I found that often the best novels in this style take as one of their specific concerns the character and imagination of a people. This emphasis is prominent, not only, as is well known, in Gabriel Garcia Marquez, himself influenced strongly by William Faulkner, but in novelists as diverse as Sierra Leone's Syl Cheney Coker, author of The Last Harmattan of Alucine Dunbar, Denmark's Peter Høeg, author of The History of Danish Dreams, and of Salman Rushdie in his relation to India and Pakistan, as well as in authors such as Trinidad's Robert Anthony, author of Divina Trace, and Guyana's Pauline Melville, The Migration of Ghosts, who, though British or American, take the place of their upbringing as the prepossessing concern of their art. If we expand our attention from stylistic movements to ideas as international agents of national consciousness formation, we may find a more revealing pattern. And here is the first of my 2 older examples. I've just finished teaching a course at the University of Dallas on the 19th century Russian novel, in which it is obvious, oh, and by the way, my co-teacher was Professor Dupree here, who you will hear from shortly. it was obvious that the major novelists, Gogol, Turgenev, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, emerged at the time that Russia was bombarded by Enlightenment ideologies. These writings proved to be the chief barometers of the national character and of the critical struggle over the nature of Russian and Slavic culture. Whereas the political outcome of this struggle was eventually disastrous, the words of these novelists on this subject have become immortal. The impact of the Enlightenment on Russia might in fact serve as a model for how technological civilization is now affecting all of the nations outside Europe and America. It tends to destroy their archaic culture, but in the process makes all their lore into material for significant literature. The American Southern poet Donald Davidson made an astute observation of this process. A traditional society, he notes, can absorb modern improvements up to a certain point without losing its character. If modernism enters to the point where the society is thrown a little out of balance, but not yet completely off balance, the moment of self-consciousness arrives. Then a process begins that at first is enormously stimulating, but that if it continues unchecked, may prove debilitating and destructive in the end. Greece in the 5th century BC, Rome of the late Republic, Italy in Dante's time, England in the 16th century, all give us examples of traditional societies invaded by changes that threw them slightly out of balance without at first achieving cultural destruction. I'm continuing a quotation from Davidson. The invasion seems always to force certain individuals into an examination of their total inheritance that perhaps they would not otherwise have undertaken. They begin to compose literary works in which the whole metaphysic of the society suddenly takes dramatic or poetic or fictional form. Their glance is always retrospective, but their point of view is always thoroughly contemporary. I think these are packed, but I think very genial remarks by Davidson. Well, the example of Russian literature is instructive. Peter the Great had insisted on requiring the inhabitants of his new city to speak only French and German, so that writers growing up in early 19th century Petersburg were unable to speak their native language. Pushkin challenged the taboo by learning peasant Russian from his nurse. But it was Gogol, arriving from the Ukraine to an intensely Europeanized Petersburg, who brought with him not only the language, but the lore of a Russia as yet untouched by the Enlightenment. Gogol not only gave a group of writers archaic and grotesque tales from a backward Kiev, but revealed to them their own humanity, caught up in the process of modernization. He restored to them their native language and sensibility, which combined with the vehicle of the European novel to produce works that continue to startle the world with their brilliance and depth. In 1842 came the most famous of these tales, The Overcoat. We all came out from under Gogol's overcoat, Dostoevsky rightly said, referring to the galvanizing effect of Gogol's famous short story on his group of cosmopolitan writers. Gogol's downtrodden little government clerk became an international literary figure, assuming a universal pathos precisely because of his provincial weirdness. Gogol was lionized by the Slavophile movement, which grew in reaction against the programmed westernization of the succession of emperors since Peter. His was the first example of the self-generation of the colonial, anti-colonial dialectic that has characterized virtually all parts of the world that came under Europe's empires in the last 300 or so years. There developed here a face-off of opposing cultural movements, Westernizers versus Slavophiles. One can see in this impulse the kindling spark of the Irish Renaissance, the fugitive poets in the American South, and the negritude movement in Africa and the Caribbean. The course of 19th century Russian culture suggests also that some of the most important episodes in the development of national literatures may well be the strife over opposing models of national consciousness. It is also a reminder that the bones of contention in these contests are often thrown in from outside. Focusing on a national perspective would be a step in the wrong direction if it were to leave out the study of interaction with foreign culture and ideas, for it is these that often prove to catalyze new national movements in search of their own particularity. So the central paradox of the field may well be that it takes otherness to become truly oneself. This is certainly inescapable today. The shaping of a national culture can hardly be accomplished without an eye to its global perception. But in essence, that dialectic has long been implicit, I want to suggest, I would say ever since Rome, and what the French philosopher Rémy Brague calls its self-conscious secondness to Greece. So my second older example takes us all the way back to a nation famed not for being a nation, but for being an empire. Yet a close look at the Aeneid reveals the rough and simple Roman character, the figure carrying Rome's national consciousness, emerging into its own only in contrast, always to its hypercultured opposite, Greek, Trojan, or Carthaginian. Roman is defined interestingly by Brague as one who knows he is situated between a classicism to imitate and a barbarity to subjugate. And that barbarity can, of course, include oneself, so it is an interior barbarity as well. Being a Roman, says Brague, is perceiving oneself as a Greek in relation to what is barbarian, but also as a barbarian to what is Greek. Brague has been invaluable in emphasizing the interculturality and intertextuality of the entire Western tradition. I'm drawing on his book called La Voix Romaine, which has been translated as eccentric culture. Horace's brilliant lines express this irony concisely. Captured Greece, captured her savage victor, and brought the arts to backward Italy. So they were quite aware of this irony in ancient times. Greece's influence on Rome is clearly a case of what in our time post-colonial discourse would call colonization in reverse. But I would have to add that if the Romans detected a certain barbarity in themselves, they set out not only to subjugate it, but to cultivate it as well, to prize it in a dialectic they came to know as founding their own sense of themselves. Anchises' famous speech to Aeneas reminds him that those whom he calls others, but who readers will know are Greeks, may plead causes better, scan the heavens more perspicaciously, sculpt more fetchingly in bronze. Romans must know themselves as other from those others, however, possessing the hardihood and backbone of a people whose art of rule arose from this awakening confrontation with the Greeks. So conscious dialogue with foreign culture and ideas has long proven decisive in national formation. And as one can see, those ideas are often strongly valenced, both positively and negatively. Rather than dwell with clear examples that bear out this open struggle from the literatures that we know, I'm led by interests of time to shift the scene now to the case in which the encounter with the outside authoritative source is forced on a people. Moreover, when a people's formation occurs entirely within the regime of that authority, so that, thinking abstractly, one might expect that a people could never form its own identity until it had gotten free of its masters. The case of Jamaica proves otherwise. As Edouard Glissant has remarked, the 8th century Gallo-Roman would have called himself a Roman. Becoming happens before its consciousness. So the Jamaican people were assembled from elsewhere as enslaved workers under the British. Yet the formation of distinctive manners and a creative deformation of the English language began early on. Today, as the only one of the greater Antilles that is neither subsumed in a larger political entity nor imploding under an embattled or unstable self-rule, Jamaica is of particular interest to observe in the case of its formation of a national consciousness of its own cultural legacy. in the 20th century. It underwent a burst of creativity in poetry that is all too little known, despite the fact that through its development of a very media-friendly musical culture, Jamaica is one of the nations that has led the way in contribution to the new idiom of an ever-present global culture. Interestingly, Jamaican poetry drew on the energy of this popular style, while at the same time embodying the English poetic tradition much more fully than American poets have chosen to do. Lawrence Bainard has termed Jamaica the most self-conscious and culturally the most advanced of West Indian nations. A 2002 draft of its national cultural policy is readily available online. It is the third largest English-speaking country in the Americas and has endowed the language with a creative richesse. Rastafarian belief and rhetoric have served as a kind of collective imaginaire for Jamaicans, on which it has drawn judiciously and to varying degrees, a testimony to the communion between folk culture and the high culture of poetry. Jamaican English also leaves a pronounced impression of elegant diction, where the United States Lockean attitudes predetermine that aristocratic accents be instinctively shunned. West Indian poets have been able to take T.S. Eliot, for instance, more as a facilitator of poetic cadence than as a forbidding and austere presence against whom to reenact a new version of the American Revolution. Eliot's poetry, and even more, his voice recordings, were highly influential for an entire generation of West Indian poets, with his street scenes and argot, intermixing of languages, and alternating free verse and rhyme, all energetic characteristics of his early verse. The early Eliot was particularly a figure of liberation for young poets held to stricter standards by British-influenced education. Since the early 20th century in Jamaica, moving in step with the twin desires for political independence and greater education, a vigorous subculture has produced coteries of writing. Notable poetic activity goes back to the beginning of the 20th century, as Claude McKay's 1912 Songs of Jamaica and Constab Ballads attest, since they were his first published volumes, antedating his departure for New York and the rising artistic movement in Harlem. Edna Manley, a sculptor and the wife of one Jamaican prime minister and the mother of another, supported the 1943 founding of Jamaica's first entirely literary periodical, Focus. In a public letter written to Dennis Scott, who was perhaps the most exemplary writer of this group, Manley recalls the growth of Jamaican poetry. The slender line coming down from what we call our early days, she says, a time when our poets leaned too heavily on the English tradition, but nevertheless produced poetry with a love of nature and the felt and seen thing. She goes on to write of the political revolution, the explosion of 1938, when universal suffrage and self-government were the magic words that set Jamaica afire, and to be a poet, one had to be a Jamaican first. This political conflagration kindled a poetic revolution as well, as she says. We were always reading to each other in those days. Mervyn Morris, who was at the epicenter of perhaps the most distinguished coterie, maintains that writing in Jamaica took off from about 1952. The University of the West Indies, founded in Kingston in 1948, became a center for the formation of West Indian consciousness, not just for Jamaica, but for the entire Caribbean and its English-speaking populations. The regional university became a point where groups of writers could assemble, propelling poetry to distinctive new achievements. It also legitimized a connection between the region's intellectuals and popular cultural forms, vitalizing serious poetry with a contemporary source of language, imagery, and attitude. Beginning with the dialect performance poetry of Louise Bennett in the 1940s, a powerful body of poems grew that was meant not only for silent reading, but for oral performance. Although Jamaica is untypical in the Caribbean in being able to pursue the development of its national culture in a steady and concerted manner, one should not miss in that consciousness a distinctive conviction that is shared widely across the Caribbean in various forms, namely, that the real impact, indeed the significance of its national culture, is not to be felt by itself, but by the world. Some of the major writers of the Caribbean come from the Lesser Antilles, where the possibilities of expecting any concerted national self-development decrease as the size of the islands decrease. These writers, however, seem to have taken the fullest advantage of their political and geographical marginality to cast a new perspective on the outlook for nationhood and interrelation in the 21st century. Now, to bring out the most in my remaining time, I want to focus on the writings of Edouard Glissant, the Martinican man of letters and Nobel candidate, whose death this past February brought to a close a distinguished career and commended his work for our careful assessment. I knew Glissant during his stay at LSU in the 80s and 90s, and this talk is dedicated to his memory. Author of over a dozen books of essays, a dozen books of poetry, 8 novels, a play, and 2 books of interviews, Glissant was certainly one of the most important writers of our day, and what I think to be his significantly changing view on national literature will remain with us to be discussed as a signature of our time. If you will, you have got a copy of the listing the works of Glissant. It may be some help in what's to come. I'm going to be drawing on several of his books, mostly from his essays. So I've tried to group those works by the genre, and then on the right-hand column to indicate which books have been translated into English. According to the intertextual terms of formation of national consciousness that I've been sketching up to now, the Caribbean writer, and like him, the writers of many other peoples around the world, are in a bad way indeed. Brague's Roman solution is a recipe for the self-sufficient. Within this perspective, the Caribbean author is caught between an international modernism to succumb to passively and a local barbarism to attempt to resuscitate. Glissant never accepted the terms of that struggle. What is striking in his work from the beginning is his belief in the potential unification of human experience and his faith that poetry's purpose is to achieve this oneness. In his book of essays, Intention Poétique, Glissant begins emphatically with the assumption of ontological totality, revealed in his use of phrases such as the concrete unity of the earth and planetary thought. In his first book of essays, Soleil de la Conscience, he had asserted that the aim of poetry is the revealing unity of the world. And in his important later work, Le Discours Antillais, he elaborates this thought. Through literature, he claims, the cry of the world becomes word, but the cri remains the cri of a particular place. Now, as critic Peter Hallward has detected, working beneath these more unitary notions of Glissant's is the engine of a recognizably Hegelian dialectic. As he points out, the specific or divers for Glissant, as for Hegel, is that through which the whole realizes itself. According to the early Glissant, the appropriate vehicle for a specific consciousness is the nation. The nation is a terre that has become connaissance. It's a land that has become knowledge. The decisive act in the literary, as in the historical realm, consists of building the nation. As Glissant goes on to say, what is a country, if not the enrooted necessity of relation to the world? The nation is the expression, henceforth grouped and matured, of this relation. Glissant culminates his poetics of the nation with this affirmation. The work of art risks becoming pale and lifeless if it doesn't receive approbation from its country. In other words, the poem can precede and found the reason of the land, but it cannot live at a distance from its substance and its flavor, which it signifies. In other words, the land must have throbbed at least once in its total freedom in order for the poem, which has signified the land, to install itself forever in its truth. This stance produces an interesting paradox concerning the national language. According to Glissant, the Martinican has no language. The people begin to speak as such only when the writer shapes their words into language. One could choose to detect here the same dual concern that led Dante to write De Vulgari Eloquentia for a disunified Italian peninsula. On the one hand, the worthiness of the local as raw material, but on the other hand, the need for an achievement of genuine illustriousness to make a language. So, if Glissant's Hegelian stance causes him to resemble Dante in a certain way, in the political realm, he moves toward emphasizing a dynamic of sacrifice, most clearly revealed in his 1961 play, Monsieur Toussaint, in which Toussaint Louverture himself provides the model. The Haitian people become nation only through Toussaint, and the process is complete only with the sacrificial dissolution of their medium. As Glissant's Toussaint tells Dessalines, the country wants your sacrifice. Toussaint says he knows that my, quote, my country needs my absence. And another quote, I must go up into the woods for the sake of the general liberty. Sacrifice, absence, going up into the woods. Here, in other words, Glissant comes to resemble not so much Dante as Virgil. Toussaint is his Aeneas. But the telling difference is that there is no imperium of Rome envisioned as a goal, no mother country like Italy to be established as a permanent substance. The nation itself, for which this sacrifice is performed, becomes a sacrifice. As Glissant writes, when the nation enables itself, it also negates itself. Now here surely he's sounding Hegelian. Right? For the consciousness of the nation is consciousness of relation. And in this he strikes his own particular note, for relation becomes increasingly important in Glissant's work. Furthermore, for Glissant as for Dante, the making of a national language is crucial. For medieval Dante, such a language is known by its fruits. It must, as he says, be canonical, cardinal, and curial. For the Hegelian Glissant, it must be known by its process. And Creole does not measure up to Glissant's standard because it does not transform things to consciousness. Unlike Haiti's national Creole, which, he says, has moved more quickly beyond detour. Martinican Creole has not managed to ponder itself, se méditer, to meditate itself, right? No more in popular wisdom than in elite decisions. So he carries on a kind of private quarrel with his own people in public in ways that sometimes reminds one of Yeats and Ireland. However, this Hegelian poetics of organicism, process, consciousness, and synthesis is dropped in his later work, beginning with Poétique de la Relation in 1990. As Hallward argues, Glissant's early work asserts the pursuit of a national specificity, and his later work abandons the nation in favor of a singular immediacy, which he calls la relation. It's as though the mediating term nation has been wiped out. The thought of Gilles Deleuze has been instrumental here, and it has simply replaced Hegelianism, beginning with Poétique de la Relation. The term identité racine yields to identité rhizome. Root identity yields to rhizome identity, following Deleuze, who understands rhizome to mean a root that forms out of encountering other roots. So relationality becomes crucial in this new vision. Now Glissant's view of Creole changes sharply. The Creole language, he says, is now the most obvious symbol of an unlimited interculturality, métissage, a language whose spirit is always to open itself out in the extraordinary explosion of cultures. Creole is suddenly transfigured into word of the world without passing through the intermediary national term he had considered so crucial before. All of these quotations here come from the Poétique de la Relation from 1990. And similarly, a term like errance, the wandering, right, is no longer a wandering outside history, a regrettable loss of time. Errance, wandering to describe the national experience, is now directly coincident with the productive movement of the world itself. An order beyond orientation, the urgency, he says, of conceiving the hidden order of the whole, so as to wander in it without getting lost. Errance, he says, is now the very working towards totality, the search for totality. The thought of errance is postulation of the sacred, which never gives itself and never erases itself. There can be no national repossession. Now, for dispossession is now the condition and opportunity of reality itself. Tellingly, Glissant's change makes no sense to a scale of values for which poetry is an instrument in service of a grander social project conceived outside it in the realm of dialectical thought. But Glissant's path turned him decisively away from his mentor's Marxism, his mentor Aimé Césaire. His early passionate allegiance to poetry was never deserted and replaced by a purely political agenda. And it seems to me that it was around the time of his move to Baton Rouge that his shift in his thought took place. It is likely then that Glissant's increasing appreciation for William Faulkner indicates something he found in Faulkner's attitude toward the American South, from being an entity with a ready-made identity and a progressive future to being a lost cause. So one can choose to dwell on the missed opportunities, the failed moments of the dialectic, as do many of Faulkner's disappointed Southerners, especially in his early work. Or one can renounce the glamorous dream and its endless lacerations, and instead turn to a prizing of the concrete, the irrelevant local texture as the test of poetry, as John Crowe Ransom did, or else revel, as Flannery O'Connor did, in a mysticism of the dispossessed. For Glissant, though he does not say it, history is over. History, understood in a Hegelian manner, as a record of continuation of the project of civilization, liberation, socialization, consciousness. Glissant writes, now, with prophetic urgency, of a world to come. It is wrong to say of that world that it will not have nations and their influence, but what can be said is that we do not know what it will have. Glissant's work, his own energeia, and hence his prophetic office, regards poiesis. And in the early 21st century, the poiesis of nations has been neglected all too much. A grander, more mystical, and awesome work stands before those who survive in this century, a poiesis of the world. Poetry circulation, he writes, poetry circulation and its action no longer conjecture a given people, but the evolution of the planet Earth. The action of human cultures identifying one another for their mutual transformation. Glissant now sees the ordeal of the Africans dispossessed and brought to the New World in Martinique as it was in Jamaica, not as a deprivation of the possibility of founding, but as a founding. As he writes, the panic of the new land, the haunting of the former land, finally the alliance with the imposed land, suffered and redeemed. The unconscious memory of the abyss served as the alluvium for these metamorphoses. He then writes of a further metamorphosis as the land beyond turned into land in itself. And here I think, these are two difficult quotations coming up, I'm sorry to say, but here I think we get to closer to the heart of his vision of change from a progressive notion of nation formation to an awareness of what the nation in itself has in its vision to offer. So he writes, the absolute unknown, projected by the abyss, and bearing into eternity the womb abyss and the infinite abyss, in the end become knowledge. Not just a specific knowledge, appetite, suffering, and delight of one particular people. Not only that, but knowledge of the whole, greater from having been in the abyss and freeing knowledge of relation within the whole. These very condensed notations describe the genesis of a poetic consciousness, ineluctably bound to a land, at first imposed and then redeemed through suffering. What was experienced and entered into is what the modern world denies, the abyss, the horror of horrors, but also the origin place of true poetic knowledge. What is spoken about here is the history and the experience of enslavement, of slavery, and the hardships that followed upon it in that world. But rather than it's being seen as a complete loss and absent, something to only to base a revolt against, to enter, as he says, to enter into that abyss in order to truly achieve knowledge of the place and the experience that one has been given. This knowledge comes only through concrete suffering and transition between two distinct places. But the abyss entered through it is, as it were, the abyss of being itself. And thus, as Glissant concludes, it is knowledge of the whole. Caribbean experience yields not merely local knowledge, then, but a freeing knowledge that may be told, but that would not be in our possession without their experience. So Glissant's anti-dialectic formulations now stubbornly defy that way of Marxian Hegelian thought that robs experience of its identity and sovereignty and makes any one event purely an instance of a future invisible realization. Glissant insists on the sovereignty of Caribbean experience and its precious yield from the abyss. A certain exasperation at these pronouncements might be forestalled if we read the struggle of nation and totality, root and rhizome, into Glissant's reading of Faulkner, which he undertook at length in his book, Faulkner, Mississippi, or in the original, Faulkner, Mississippi. Absalom meant a great deal to Glissant. He discovered levels in it that were for the most part unavailable to American critics. In The Fall of the House of Sutpen, he discerns the end of the nationalist project. Now here is Glissant on Absalom. But the tragic crisis, magnificently and ritually brought to completion in the burning of the House of Sutpen, will not restore legitimacy. On the contrary, the moment consecrates the inevitable obliteration of it. You will recall the end of Absalom and the burning of Thomas Sutpen's house. Faulknerian tragedy is at odds with that of Aeschylus. It does not contribute to reestablishing the balance of a community. It commits the heresy of destroying the sacredness of filiation, which he means relation of father to son, secure passing down of the father's legacy to the son. And in the final final clause of this observation, Glissant says, it closes the history of the sons of Solomon forever and lays out the prospect to the sons of Snopes, the unmitigated upstart. Sutpen's dynastic house burning spells the end of the project of nation building, the end of the root and the rise of the rhizome, Snopes, who spread out uncontrollably in every direction. Faulkner's wisdom is estimable. He resists conferring any glamour on these raw upshoots of human authenticity. Snopes is the irony awaiting the aesthetes of the rhizome. But Faulkner does not leave us hanging between tragedy and satiric farce. The House of Snopes is not an entirely hopeless vision, though it would take a patient study of Faulkner's late novels, The Town and the Mansion, to disclose a more hopeful side. There, in the least of the Snopeses, Mink Snopes, the dispossessed, find their vision of the totalité. Glissant claims that Flem Snopes, at the end of his life in the mansion, faces his own death calmly, like the old aristocrat, Colonel John Sartoris, whom he otherwise in no way resembles, and that what this means is that Faulkner himself was unaware of what he would find in the Snopeses. We have long believed, he writes, that Flem Snopes was a limit, only a limit, and certainly this Snopes knows nothing of the ardent ride, of epic excess. But then we discover that he is also an abyss, a void, which Faulkner himself did not suspect when he began the Snopes Chronicle. In the Snopes saga, Faulkner traces the ingenious reduction to banality, arriving finally at the great earthly rallying point of death. Mink Snopes, whom he calls the dim-witted but visionary peasant, finds at the end of the mansion that the earth never stops pulling us imperceptibly down to where all who have suffered hell on this same earth are assembled with neither rank nor interference nor discrimination as miserable compensation for the failure of the great enterprise of making a foundation. And Glissant goes on to quote the closing words of Faulkner's The Mansion, the last of the Snopes trilogy. Himself among them, equal to any, good as any, brave as any, and this is all referring to Mink Snopes, who has just killed Flim Snopes, being inextricable from, anonymous with all of them, the beautiful, the splendid, the proud, and the brave, right on up to the very top itself, among the shining phantoms and dreams, which are the milestones of the long human recording, Helen and the bishops, the kings and the unhomed angels, the scornful and graceless seraphim. So clearly, Glissant has encountered Faulkner at length and in depth, seeing the significance in the late works of Faulkner, whom most American Faulknerian scholars have neglected or disparaged. Now, if we keep in mind this distinction between, if you will, the House of Sutphin and the House of Snopes, essentially the franchise of the dispossessed, that is, we will see why the path Glissant's meditations have gone down is not about the demise of a national literature. It is a notice that national literature does not have to be imagined as a bulwark of power, a bank for control and mastery. Flim Snopes' bank I'm thinking of here. Imagine Glissant lecturing about relation to a Martinican audience, full of the desire to know what to do with their creativity. The spirit is released in a new direction, and it is to play a role that is not for its home project of nation building, but to lend insight to people the world over. Glissant says to grasp is no longer the best verb for the mental action required of our time. Rather, he declares, it is a French portmanteau verb phrase that I'm going to give you right now, donner avec, rendered awkwardly in the English as to give on and with. To give on in English has the idiomatic meaning to open out upon. The mastery of grasping in both its senses, to possess and to gain conceptual command of, must be sacrificed if one is to enter into relation, and one must do so by opening out with open hands and a readiness for far horizons. Recalling Faulkner's quickening influence on Garcia Marquez, one can see why Glissant turns to Faulkner with approval. Faulkner has been a force to make other writers of the Pan-American world discover themselves. Glissant insists Faulkner's oeuvre will be complete when it is revisited and made vital by African Americans. Faulkner's work demands no less daring a response from those who have suffered the most than from those who have inflicted the most in their unstoppable conjunction. Prophet of this striving toward an unimagined epic future, Glissant calls for a nation not to relate primarily to the state and to power, placing all its stakes in building itself, but rather to reach down deep within the abyss of its place and its time and find the inner life of poetry that he seems to think is the only force today that can navigate us toward a unification of our hearts and minds. Thank you. Yes, Mark.
I'm a practical man. So let me try to formulate a practical question. It seems to me that the structure of the talk will sort of have this two two ways of imagining national literature. One as this progressive national cultural formation project. Another as perhaps it's the persistence model. So once you give up on that, there's still something there that the nation has to say. I'm sort of wondering in terms of genres, though. In other words, is that a particularly Caribbean insight? Because obviously, Rome, its national literature is an epic.
Yes.
Is the epic.
Yes.
I'm wondering if a Jamaican writer can write an epic,
Right.
given the experience that's given to them.
Only as a symbolist poem, probably.
So a suburban, right?
Right.
Something like
Yeah.
that. So in other words, is that are we to look for in particular national experiences, particular genres that are available and unavailable, that would be characteristic of the national cultural consciousness?
Mark, thank you. That's a good question, and I'm gonna give two responses that'll hit somewhere around there, if I can keep my mind together on it. The first is the notion: is this a widespread Caribbean notion? I would say so. I think Glissant, of course, makes it harder than other writers do, and I apologize for that. But such authors as Antonio Benitez Rojo, who wrote The Repeating Island, has talked about all these different versions of understanding that from Caribbean authors, that they have an influence outside their own island, and part of what, in other words, the medium is the message to a certain extent. Part of what they are broadcasting to the world is relationality, is being able to relate to other people's other words, other languages, and combine them in creative ways. Wilson Harris in Guyana, another of those. Many authors that stress that kind of that notion of the rhizome here. And for Glissant, he just makes a greater point that it's a kind of liberation from the guilt felt with failing at the project of nation building from over and over and over again. Just go ahead and be your own intensity, and that itself, he wants to claim, will yield a greater truth. Right? Well, it is obviously more honest, in other words. What was the second point? I was afraid I would forget it. You were asking also about
available genres. Is it really impossible for a Jamaican to write an epic?
Right. Good. Yeah. Well, Glissant.
In a way that it would be unavoidable for the Romans to write an epic.
Well, the first thing that caught my ear about Glissant when he appeared on campus was that he was talking about epic all the time, right? And he seemed quite at home from Homer on, through the Song of Roland and so forth. And I would think that what this change means in him is that he's re-envisioning epic in the present, and seeing it not as something that one can actually emulate as a narrative, as a record of deeds, right, or as an imagined record of deeds even, but rather as a calling forth of the epic spirit in a poetic way, an atemporal way, in the way that lyric poetry is perhaps a better model for. I think we'll understand more of him when more of his poetry is read and understood. But he's a difficult man to understand, and making his base in Deleuze rather than Hegel doesn't make it any easier.
What? How would you compare Derek Walcott and Edouard Glissant?
Good. They're both great men model, right? Based on Yeats, right? I am the spokesman for my people, and able to pass judgment on his people, and so forth. I think Walcott is very concerned about his own art greatly, and less so, I think, about where it is all going, about what the kind of impact that it's going to have. I think there is, again, something I find that I like in Glissant is that generosity of spirit, that he is truly concerned as not merely making a show of, not merely doing it for the sake of being admired, that he's truly concerned with with his own people and his people's culture.
I have a comment, if I may.
Yes, please.
I think what we've heard is the kind of model that is part of the dialectic of CNL. In other words, we have to have people who go in depth in an area, in an author, and give us as much information, as much of their expert knowledge and criticism as possible, because those are the dots that will have to be put together eventually, you know, connected in some way. I'll play the devil's advocate for a moment. Everything you said was very interesting, but from the point of view of CNL, suppose someone in Australia said, so what? What is important? Eventually, we will have to face this question. What is so important about Glissant or anyone else in that area that we have to include them in this overview of emergent and neglected literatures, which is CNL? Now, I'm not asking you, I'm not putting you on the spot,
Okay.
but this is part of our work. In other words,
Yes,
it's a constant oscillation, a dialectic back and forth from the particulars to something more general that will give us eventually the kind of national or international, I hate to use that word, but the kind of national program we need. It's not going to happen tomorrow, it's not going to happen next week, it may not happen for years in the future, but it will happen. And I think we have a kind of advantage because we've done so much work in this area for 30 years, 40 years actually, all right? So that when the time comes, if we have enough of this kind of input, we can begin to look at structures that may work on the campuses. And that's where the future of CNL lies, on the campuses, where we have this constant probing into the particulars and an author, a literature, and then, on the other hand, trying to relate it in some way to the larger tapestry, which is multi-comparative literary studies. I just wanted to make that point again in between because it's a very important one in terms of what we're doing. So this has a very good place in what we're doing, as I'm sure your talk also will have. But you know, we have to remind ourselves of the two extremes, if you like, but they're really essentials. If you're going to do anything at all in the way of greater awareness of the global mandate of bringing in emergent and neglected literatures, you're going to have to do this kind of oscillation constantly. It's constant. It's not just one day or once in a while. It has to be a constant thing, working on that and working on trying to integrate it into the larger spectrum. So, thank you very much.
Very good. Well, thank you. Thank you.
He also received his bachelor's degree at the University of Dallas, furthering the incestuous theme. And also, like Bainard Cowan, got his PhD from Yale. He was, in fact, I've heard, a member of the third class of the University of Dallas. Is that right? Third? Third entering class of the University of Dallas. And taught Bainard Cowan when he was at the University of Dallas. He is the author of a book on Alan Tate, a book on the French philosopher Gaston Bachelard, and he's also has an annotated anthology of 17th century English poetry. His writing ranges widely. He's written on Alexander Pope, on Virgil's Aeneid, and Philip Roth, among many other things. And he is here today to speak with us about We Are One, We Are Singapore, creating a national literature ex nihilo.
Thank you very much. 1 month ago today, I was in Barcelona, where I was reminded, interestingly enough, second here, had something rather interesting happen to me, which I cannot explain. There it is. Anyway, to begin again. 1 month ago I was in Barcelona, and I was reminded while I was there that the Catalans, who are a people who've had many centuries of aspiring to become a nation, never have achieved that status. And I've long been interested in this whole business of the difference between a nation and a people. And I've also long been interested in the phenomenon of the modern city-state as a descendant of the ancient Greek polis and the medieval Italian city republic. In fact, I've taught in or visited a number of them. It became a sort of hobby to collect them for a while. San Marino, Vatican City, Andorra, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, and eventually Brunei. But 23 years ago, on July 1st, 1988, when I and my family first arrived in Singapore, I felt as though I'd been dropped into a laboratory that was in the midst of a crucial ongoing experiment. This particular modern city-state was different from the others I'd experienced. It was a nation trying to become a people. I was due to begin teaching as a Fulbright professor in only a few days at the National University there, and knew little about the character of the place in which I was to spend the next 2 years. I soon discovered that I was in a special environment, beginning with the printed slogan I glimpsed on the dashboard of the taxi that took us from the airport to our temporary hotel. It read, "We are one, we are Singapore." It didn't take me long to grasp the implications of that brief inscription, which turned out to be an official directive from the People's Action Party. What was startling for me as a newcomer in Singapore was to realize that I was in the presence of a nation not quite a quarter of a century old, that had been defined mostly in negative terms by its fears for the future and the necessity imposed from without of maintaining an independence that was not quite of its own choosing. It was a nation in search of a people and a collective sense of mentality, language, and feelings, an identity that had to encompass a diversity of origins, traditions, religious practices, ethnicities, and languages that were the residue of its colonial past and had not yet gelled into an identifiable shared character. In short, nation building in reverse. Singapore was founded by Sir Stamford Raffles of the East India Company in January 1819. And so to put this in perspective, I should point out that this was some 13 years before the creation of Chicago, at 23 before Shanghai began its rapid expansion into a major point of Western contact and trade from a small village, and before Hong Kong was founded. So Singapore is in many ways a city contemporary with a lot of American cities. Concerned by rapid Dutch expansion in Southeast Asia, Raffles decided to establish a trading post on a sparsely inhabited, jungle-packed island at the tip of southern Malaysia called Singapura, Sanskrit for Lion City. And the story goes in the 14th century that one of the sultans visiting that area thought he saw a lion. It was probably a tiger. There've never been lions in Singapore, but more about that later. It was a most successful venture and expanded to a population of 5,000 inhabitants in 2 years, with a traffic of 3,000 ships and 8 million Spanish dollars in trade. 5 years after its founding, it had not only a 60% Malay population from a population of about 25 originally when it was founded, but also a multi-ethnic society that included Arabs, Armenians, Europeans, Indians, Balinese, Bugis or Javanese from Indonesia, and an increasing flow of Chinese immigrants. But by 1830, the Chinese were already in the majority, as they remain today. By the end of the century, Singapore's port dominated the region, and it continues to do so. It is one of the world's busiest today. The refinery, petroleum refinery in Singapore is third largest in the world, and its port is sometimes second and sometimes third busiest. So it's a place that from the start seems to have been successful, mainly because of its location, but also because of the British who founded it. It has doubled in the 2 decades when I was there, from 2.5 million in population to slightly over 5 million currently. Now, if you think about that, you have to wonder what's going on. Of those 5 million now, about 60% are native Singaporeans. The central urban area is full of high-rises. When we arrived, my children thought they were in another modern American city with an unusually large Asian population. 90% of all Singaporeans own their own homes. In character, despite a highly centralized one-party government, the nation is solidly middle class. Shopping and dining are said to be the main pastimes of Singaporeans. If ever there was a nation of shopkeepers, this is it. Though the electronics and petroleum industries have had a considerable impact on its economy, the former especially after Texas Instruments established a manufacturing plant there in 1968, so that for decades after that, hard drives, if you bought a hard drive for your computer, it came from Singapore. In order to convey the sense of the taxicab motto that greeted me upon arrival, I must say a word or two about the quarter century of Singaporean history that preceded my stay. In 1963, after a successful and peaceful bid for independence from Britain, Singapore became a part of the Federation of Malaysia out of economic necessity, only to be asked to leave 2 years later. Friction between the capital, Kuala Lumpur, and Singapore led to this amicable divorce, abetted by a conflict with Indonesia, ongoing at the same time, and especially the infamous race riots of 1964, when on the anniversary of Muhammad's birthday, Chinese and Malays clashed in Singapore over a sort of equal opportunity provision for Malays, a minority in Singapore, though a majority in Malaysia and the Federation as a whole. From that time on, there was a concerted effort on the part of the government, especially after the island had become nationally independent, to forestall even the slightest hint of ethnic or racial conflict. Confined to an island with no natural resources except for its own people, the leaders of Singapore were understandably concerned about any potential source of disruption that might disturb the delicate balance of a multi-ethnic citizenry, to say nothing of maintaining peaceful and profitable relationships with their more powerful neighbors, Malaysia to the north, south, and west, and Indonesia to the west and south. In short, upon being forced into an involuntary independence, the government had suddenly become responsible for creating a national identity. And this is, in my mind, a very tricky affair indeed. And speaking about what we were discussing just before, it is this very thing that I think is so important about Singapore as a historical model for us to understand. Now, I didn't quite grasp, even after a few months, what was going on until I discovered an article in the Straits Times, the main newspaper, that Deputy Prime Minister-elect Goh Chok Tong, who became Prime Minister just a few months after we left in 1990, had proclaimed his discovery that Singapore had no national ideology. Those were his words. and he had therefore appointed a committee to write one. He succeeded the founding Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew only shortly afterwards, and he meant every word he said. You see, Lee Kuan Yew, who was responsible for guiding Singapore through its first quarter century of independence, graduated double-starred first honors from Cambridge in economics and politics, and Goh Chok Tong earned an MA in developmental economics from Williams College in Massachusetts. Not naive. And when he used the word national ideology, he knew exactly what he was talking about. Toto, we're not in Kansas anymore, I thought to myself. This compelling need to establish a national identity was, I discovered, closely tied to the development of a literature with a Singaporean stamp. But it had to be of a special nature, could not be expected to evolve naturally over a long period of time, and needed to be forged almost out of desperation. Despite the government's Confucian slogans for unity and diversity posted everywhere, it was clear that this was not simply a top-down directive, but a collective necessity. Singapore could not survive without some form of internal nation-building effort, and it had to involve every element of the population while preserving the ethnic character of every constituency's source of origin. There also had to be an overarching, specifically Singaporean sense of distinctiveness that could overcome any nostalgia for the old country. As a result of this quest for equal representation and fairness, the nation honors more religious holidays than I have ever encountered anywhere, with a potentially interesting impact on work ethic. Though, thanks largely to the majority of Chinese, a considerable number of whom combine both Protestant and Confucian work ethics, that does not seem to be a problem. Still, this conspicuous even-handedness does not go very far towards forging the sense of a people. On the linguistic side, there is a further complication. Most immigrants to Singapore over its almost two-century history have come from the southern regions of India or China and speak dialects or languages that were not those adopted by their 20th century governments as official languages. For example, though they are dying out, the main Chinese dialects are Hakka, Hainanese, Teochew, Hokkien, and even Cantonese to some extent, among a total of 20 dialects, while Mandarin, the official language of China, is spoken at home by very few. Indian immigrants tend to speak Tamil, not Hindi, but they speak other Indian languages too. The whole time I was in Singapore, I was able to converse informally in Mandarin with only one person for 15 minutes, a Chinese taxi driver who, like me, was studying Mandarin. Nevertheless, the government recognized that the so-called Chinese dialects, a number of whom have no standard written forms, could not be given official recognition. And so it was Mandarin that was designated among the 4 co-official languages of Singapore, which include English, Malay, and Tamil, not Hindi. And the reason for these is obvious. English will serve quite nicely as a language of commerce and trade with India and the rest of the world, but for the vast potentials of the Chinese market for Singaporean trade, only Mandarin will do. From time to time, I would glimpse in the newspaper reports on businessmen who had managed lucrative deals in China because they were fluent in Mandarin. And another government slogan, right alongside "We are one, we are Singapore," was "Speak Mandarin." In 1988, shortly after arriving, all of this was brought to my attention in a groundbreaking play by Kuo Pao called Mama Looking for a Cat. It was the first multilingual play staged in Singapore. And it was about the conflict between generations over the Hokkien dialect spoken by Mama, who can't find her cat, and her children, who have learned Mandarin, but who speak mostly English. And so this conflict between the mother's native dialect and the official language, and the children who are, in any case, more interested in English, is played out when the children kill her cat to compensate for this old fuddy-duddy stuff that needs to be left behind. Therefore, you can see a kind of conflict between these dialects on the one hand, which are part of the past and the heritage, and the need for a version of Chinese that will work everywhere. This was brought especially home to me when one day a student of mine, whom I'll talk about later, came to my office to talk, and I was studying a Mandarin grammar. And he said, Professor Dupree, studying Mandarin law. He says, you put us to shame. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, you know, so difficult. And I said, well, yes, but what did you do for a second language? Because everyone has to do two languages. And he said, Bahasa Malaysia. He said, so much easier la. I said, but what do you speak at home? He said, dialect. Because he was Chinese. I have to add that he doesn't consider himself particularly Chinese, in fact. And that's interesting. He sees himself as Singaporean and is English speaking and writing. Singapore never attempted to play down or throw off its colonial past because it was the foundation of its parliamentary system and above all the provider of that useful tool for commerce, the English language. But Malay and Tamil could be respected and even encouraged because they added to business as usual and could be recognized according to different criteria, those for maintaining internal stability. The majority of the instruction there during my time was carried out in English through all the schools and the universities. But in a country that seems often to be prepared to turn on a dime, I was not surprised to learn that Mandarin has gained more prominence now in the last 20 years, even though very few people can be said to speak it natively. And be that as it may, English in Singapore exists in its own local flavors, sometimes referred to as Singlish, and the la that I quoted just then is a particle, an emphatic particle that Singaporeans put at the ends of phrases and that has its origins in southern Chinese dialects. A colleague of mine who was chair of the English department jokingly wrote a paper, published a paper, in which he claimed that la came from Shakespeare originally. You'll find it in Shakespeare used as an exclamation. Well, the authoritative nature of the Singaporean political environment, which one commentator referred to as capitalist Leninism, may be lamented or criticized in the West, yet in some ways it makes perfectly good sense for a nation that still feels threatened on a variety of fronts and has to remain agile and alert. Only weeks ago, an article appeared in USA Today on improvements in water filtration technology in Singapore that would allow the use of water from the foulest sources. Water, which has to be imported from either Indonesia or Malaysia, has frequently been at the center of the island's political relationship with both countries. When I asked my honors students, then in their early 20s, what they considered the single most prominent Singaporean characteristic, their answers were anxiety and cabin fever. Now, this all-consuming concern with survival and with the confinement to a small island is not without its local critics, and here is where the arts play a dual role in shaping a national sensibility. From the start, independence demanded the development of a literature that would generate a collective sense of national character, along with an ability, nevertheless, to continue the ethnic traditions. And leaders of the government have been active sponsors of literary and artistic activity, even though the results are sometimes critical of the very society they are trying to build. The beginning of Singaporean literature is difficult to pinpoint, though there's evidence of literary efforts on the island as early as 1830. One must consider whether or not to start with the founding of the colony, the formation of a government as part of the Malaysian Federation, or independence in 1965 as the key moment. And I will take this last as the important one. Though some of the founding writers of what is now reckoned as Singaporean letters began under the umbrella of the Federation, and therefore might be considered as English language Malaysian literature, which still exists, by the way, it seems to me that the determining factor is whether or not they contributed to the concept of a nation called Singapore and a people called Singaporeans. If we inspect the first seminal efforts, for example, we discover that the pioneers of Singaporean literature were emerging alongside what later would be their Malaysian counterparts. They were comrades in search of a voice. Among them was a young man by the name of Edwin Thumboo. This is Thumboo, and I hope you have a sheet that gives you his name and the spelling of it particularly. He was born in 1933 of mixed Indian, Chinese, and Japanese heritage. He was to emerge eventually as the unofficial poet laureate of Singapore and the grand old man of Singaporean letters. He began as a Malaysian writer under the guidance of a teacher and mentor from the UK, and he ended as one who helped shape the identity of an emergent people. And this is the theme of much of his poetry and many of his critical essays. Though he considered his greatest influence to be that of W.B. Yeats, he wrote his doctoral dissertation not on him, but on African poetry. He was active in Singaporean education for many years. During my 2 years at NUS, he was my dean, and I enjoyed his company on a number of occasions. His niece happened to be among my students. Poet, playwright, and novelist Robert Yeo once told me of Thumboo's coming to his school and reading some of his poetry there. It was a revelation to this younger writer, born in 1940, who realized for the first time that one could write poetry about native plants and themes instead of aping those of distant European letters. This testimony, it seems to me, sums up the importance of Thumboo's literary initiative. He gave the island an English-speaking literary voice. I won't recite the many awards and visiting professorships abroad that were part of Thumboo's career. Those, as well as a good selection of his poetry and essays, are available simply by searching the internet. Though, by the way, you won't find any of those sources emanating from the United States. This is interesting. Not many in the United States know much about this literature in English from Singapore. I want to look closely at a handful of his seminal poems, 2 to be precise, especially those that are directly concerned with the nature and character of his society. So, first of all, principal among them is Ulysses by the Merlion. Now, you all know what a Merlion is, of course, so I won't explain that it is a lion sort of mermaid. That is the pronounced Merlion. And so if you just take the maid out of mermaid and substitute lion for lion from Lion City, then you get the Merlion. And if you look at the top left picture, rightmost picture on your sheet, you can barely see him. He's quite large, and he has a fish tail. By the way, this poem has by now been inscribed in stone on a plaque near the monument. It's regarded as being in some way a kind of national poem. If ever there is an instance of intertextuality, this poem exhibits it. It's a very interesting one. Thumboo draws on Tennyson's Ulysses to begin with, just as Tennyson drew on Dante, Dante on Virgil, Virgil on Homer. There's a kind of continuum, then, that brings the Western literary tradition to Southeast Asia in Tumbu's imagination, where it is combined with the local and made truly international. The Singaporean poet Ulysses, however, is not Tennyson's, nor Dante's. He is one who has kept faith with Ithaca, another island city-state. He is also one who has met strange people, singing new myths, made myths himself. Nevertheless, he is startled by what he finds in Singapore, this image of a lion united with a fish, half beast, half fish, called the Merlion, and the place built by the peoples, note the plural, who settled here, brought to this island the bounty of these seas, built towers topless as Ilium's. They make, they serve, they buy, they sell. Despite unequal ways, together they mutate, explore the edges of harmony, search for a center, have changed their gods, kept some memory of their race in prayer, laughter, the way their women dress and greet. They hold the bright, the beautiful, good ancestral dreams within new visions, so shining, urgent, full of what is now. And Ulysses goes on to ask tentatively, if in the future these people who, having dwelt in things, surfeited on them, might once again yearn for images, adding to the dragon, phoenix, Garuda, Naga, those horses of the sun, this lion of the sea, this image of themselves. Garuda is the Hindu divinity and mount of the god Vishnu, with the body of a man, head of a bird, red wings, an eagle's beak, wearing a crown. He's the mythological ancestor of birds, but he's also a composite beast. According to what I've read, he's also a national emblem for Thailand and Indonesia. Likewise, Naga is a snake god, sometimes depicted with both human and serpent-like traits, and the nemesis of Garuda in the same epic, and is also a symbol associated with Bali. The familiar dragon, phoenix, and four immortal horses of Helios from the west are conjoined with their fabulous fellows in divine beast kind from the east. But the Merlion is a modern symbol invented in recent times to signify the lion city and to provide it with something comparable to these ancient mythological composite figures. The Merlion is a deliberate concoction, a modern symbol that represents as much a will to myth as a symbol of the city and a chamber of commerce image. Tumbu's mentor Yeats, who's not averse to creating as well as recovering such myths, is clearly his guide in this instance. Does a modern city-state require a myth of its own, in addition to a flourishing economy? Ulysses finds this burgeoning country to be a strange new phenomenon, a people attempting to devise a conscious myth of itself as a means of identity. Yet this identity can only be that of a hybrid, a being not unlike that of Yeats's image of Ireland as a centaur, with part of its body in the air and its feet firmly planted in the ground of folk and traditional myth. Can Singapore hope to match such an ambition by creating an emblem of itself that suggests power and dignity rather than some mongrel animal? Tumbu's poetry is often concerned with the way images change, gods die. His second collection of poetry was entitled Gods Can Die. And the past in general, with all the images of experience it contains, which vanishes without a trace, and which, despite an occasional expression of nostalgic longing, he persists in hoping will add up to something, that in times, images of power, our emergent selves will be familiar. A poem he wrote when he was in Iowa City. It's entitled Autumn, Iowa City, and he was there at the University of Iowa. In a poem I had the opportunity to discuss with him, entitled The Way Ahead, he speaks of the challenges of urban planning. How, he says, to frame a city, to talk of beauty in a town, how the town would change, turn supple, rugged, yet acceptable. Each of those on the committee assigned to this task, a typical Singaporean committee, a professor, a senior civil servant, a town planner, and an, quote, average man. And the speaker is the average man. Each has a different version of what Singapore should be or become. The speaker, the average man, concludes the poem by saying, a city is the people's heart, beautiful, ugly, depending on the way it beats, and is for people, for living, the reception we give ourselves, what we prepare for our posterity. He ends by claiming that the city is what we make it, you and I. We are the city, for better or for worse. The suggestion of a wedding vow that terminates the poem underlines the notion that a city-state is made, not born. But even so, utopia is precluded by the mixture of traits that constitute that marriage, that may not be perfect, but may at least give its denizens relief from the demands of a too calculated environment from a city planner. Free space between skyscrapers, rest from the weary pursuit of prosperity. As he puts it in a more recent poem from the turn of the present century, as poet, he dwells in a land where man and nature is a different story. My neighbor is another language. Tumbu has long been interested in the questions of nationalism in literature, beginning with his visits to Africa in 1968 and his doctoral thesis on African writers, finished the following year. As he said 10 years ago, what is interesting about national identity is that those who are in search of it talk about it. Those who have it consider it unimportant because they have it. He goes on to say, national identity is a notion as well as a series of gestures. It is an idea as well as a reality. The reality has yet to come in full. We are moving towards it. The first move was when we ceased to be purely Indians, Malays, and Chinese, that we were also Singaporeans. We gradually moved through the generations to a sense of being Singaporean Chinese, Singaporean Indian, Singaporean Malay. Our reflexes started to overlap. The ethnic labels turned from noun to adjective. We now see ourselves as Chinese Singaporeans, Malay Singaporeans, or Indian Singaporeans. That is the next stage, I hope. I do not know how far it is down the road when people would simply say, I am Singaporean. If Edwin Tumbu is the doyen, in the literal and figurative senses, of Singaporean letters, he was dean at NUS, the doyen is the best-selling novelist and short story writer Catherine Lim, L-I-M, his junior by some 9 years. She is better known outside Singapore than any other author on the island. You can buy her books in the United States. Lim, who specializes in novels and short stories about Asian women and their roles in society, and therefore she's got a double perspective, the role of women in their emerging role in Singaporean society on the one hand, and also this mix of Chinese and English. By the way, she was born in Malaysia, went to a Roman Catholic school in Malaysia, and then immigrated to Singapore 2 years after it became independent, and remains a Singaporean citizen and a very prominent person in the city. She did something very interesting. In 1994, she resigned her post as a professor of linguistics at the National University of Singapore. This is where I met her in faculty meetings. Not the best place to meet someone, I might add, that you might like to talk to about something else. But in any event, she resigned in 1992 to devote herself full-time to writing, and then in 1994 wrote a notorious article that challenged the ruling party, the People's Action Party. She shares with Tumbu the same desire to make Singaporeans an imaginatively richer, less confined and self-confining people by prodding them to look beyond the narrow limits of mere material and political survival. But her attack is quite different from his. I shall skip over her popular novels, which are acclaimed to fame outside Singapore, and focus instead on a volume of gently satirical stories she published in 1988 under the title of Oh, Singapore. She carried her, each of the stories pinpoints a foible common among Singaporeans that is the result of the paternalistic concerns of the government and the strains and stresses that result when a collectivism, both inculcated and culturally inherited, clashes with a strong individualistic drive to succeed, especially in business. She describes curious diseases, such as those emanating from kiasuism, which is the calculating, self-protecting behavior of Singaporeans, which is illustrated by when the introduction of banquets, of all-you-can-eat banquets came to Singapore, Singaporeans were delighted because it was a bargain, you know. And Singaporeans hate not ever to get their money's worth. They think they've not received their money's worth, they complain. On the other hand, she points out, if they happen to get more than they paid for it, they're delighted. So this is called kiasuism. And another trait, hum-subism, is a brand of lecherousness, said to be peculiar to Chinese males. And so she has two stories on each of those that are very, very funny, incidentally. The shifting policies of the government to assure the prosperity of the nation and population it serves are skewered in a number of stories that play with the ironic flip-flops characteristic of the official promotions referred to as campaigns, one of which was the one I first noticed upon arrival. They included the two-child campaign, which came right after the one-child per family campaign in China, which was launched when the government feared a rapidity of population growth that might overwhelm the island's meager economic and other resources, especially water. Then that campaign was succeeded not long afterwards by the 3 or more campaign if you can afford it, when the leaders became aware that they needed a larger, not a smaller population, in fact. There was the no spitting campaign, the no smoking campaign, and even, this was enforced after I left, the no chewing gum campaign. The reason for these last 3 was simply because they forestalled practices that might discourage tourism to the island, and anything that is bad for business is certainly bad for Singapore. One of the stories pits a Confucian sage against a Shakespeare-quoting younger man who is courting a beauty queen in a sort of dating game, and he succeeds because his Shakespearean quotes outdo the sage's Confucian quotes. In fact, what Liam is obviously doing is showing that in the end, what has made Singapore successful is its undoing in trying to create a people who have any values that anyone will admire. So she writes a final story that by the way, one of the stories tells of a politician who fails to be elected but takes on a metaphorical turn when his unkempt and increasingly flowing beard is taken, lice, vermin, and all, as a representation and gauge of the population of Singapore. And so as the beard grows and the lice crawl in and out, they adopt him as a sort of counter Merlion. A final story tells of a fictitious, or real, International Writers' Conference in Oslo, to which Catherine Lim submits a story as a representation of the positive image of Singapore that the world already has of us, she writes to one of the bureaucratic divisions of the government. Ultimately, by the time her piece has wended its way through the various offices of the government and been reduced to incoherence by their directives and suggestions, she fails to win the prize, any prize, but receives a special mention because the jury says of all the entries that they've received, it is the one that they are altogether incapable of understanding. So they give it a special award. It's been reduced to incoherence by the various strictures. What seems to be characteristic of the Singaporean identity, at least in her depiction, is a series of traits that are mostly negative, an avoidance of rather than a positive assertion of. The only thing that holds all Singapore together, she sees, is gain in both senses of the word. By the way, on her webpage, she regularly publishes 4-line aphoristic satirical verses she calls vignettes, and she describes them as an important legacy of values to leave behind. A recent one reads, "A new religion in Singapore? A brand new monotheism? It has worshippers island-wide. Its name is moneytheism." Nostalgia for a rapidly vanishing past with all its memories seems to span generations among Singaporean writers. It is no doubt the result of an increasingly accelerated rate of change. After all, the island went from being a sleepy, impoverished fishing village and port in 1965 to a dominant international economic and trading presence within a very short time. As a consequence, much of the island looks very different after about a decade, and I would be very interested in going back now after 21 years and seeing what it looks like. I know it looks very different even from the Singapore I left. One of my students, whom I got to know fairly well and with whom I collaborated musically on occasion, in addition to directing his honors thesis, was a young man by the name of Kelvin Tan. He was already making a name for himself locally as a musician and as a playwright when I met him. 2 years after I departed, he published his first work of fiction, All Broken Up and Dancing. In a short time, it became a kind of underground classic among Singaporean youth. Indeed, it may be said to speak in many respects for the concern of a whole generation now entering their 30s and 40s. In this debut novel, Tan makes use of 3 different narrative points of view. First, second, and third person voices are intermixed. Going far beyond the first and third person points of view combined in Dickens' Bleak House or Philip Roth's Letting Go, to say nothing of Michel Butor's experimental use of the second person in his novel La Modification, Modification. However, I doubt that his own combining of all 3 was inspired by any other. More likely, it was the consequence of his interest in Mikhail Bakhtin and that Russian critic's concept of narrative polyphony, which Tan explored in his honors thesis at the National University, only 2 years before the novel. The notion of the polyphonic makes eminent sense to a Singaporean who is particularly aware of the way that a multiplicity of ethnic and linguistic strains can coexist through their intertwining, even though that was the consequence of political necessity rather than a spontaneous choice. The young protagonist, who calls himself Brinsley Bivouac, not his real name, tells his story from shifting points of view in polyperspectival fashion, even though he himself has a difficult time understanding and accepting the points of view of others, even his close friends. His denial of his Chinese ethnic background can therefore be interpreted either as a revolt against his dysfunctional family and his father's Sumism, or the expression of a desire to be identified not with a country of origin, be it that of the United Kingdom or of China, but with the land of his birth. This point is underscored by Brinsley's date of birth, only a year before Singapore became an independent nation. In 1964, also Kelvin Tan's year of birth, by the way. And he explains that because he was born a year before independence, he has a difficult time staying on time. Now, you may recognize something here. Surely there's an echo of Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children, whose protagonist was born in the same year as modern India in its independence. And I'm sure Kelvin is doing this deliberately. In any case, the ethnic Chinese in Singapore often practice a kind of polynominalism, to coin a term, a hybrid of names that closely parallels what we might call polynomotics, which I did not coin, but means multiple cultural points of view, multiple values, and multiple views of reality. Since a surname in Chinese, as in many cultures, comes first, followed by what we would call the first and middle names, all a young person has to do is choose a favorite Western name and place it before the family name in Chinese. If parents have not already assigned an English first name in this fashion to their child, he or she can do so later on, establishing a separate, second, self-appointed identity. My students did this all the time. Thus, the author's full name is Kelvin Tan Liu Leong. And Kelvin explained to me that he never used his Chinese name because he said, first of all, I don't feel particularly Chinese, and secondly, my first name is usually a girl's name. One of the characters in his novel is referred to as a girl who has changed her first English name more than once. And in fact, I was aware of several instances of this practice among my own students. I would call the roll and she'd say, oh, that's not my name now. In some ways, this choice of an English first name, neatly integrated into the full Chinese name, is the index of this polynominalism and this polynomotics, a shift in perspective that can be willed by its bearer. It says a great deal about his or her aspirations, cultural models, or relationship with friends and family. And so I was intrigued when I first read Kelvin's novel, which he sent to me. You will have a hard time finding copies of it, I can guarantee that. But I recognized immediately that there was something going on here that the young people who were his fans had latched onto. And I would say that we are beginning to see something of the emergence of a Singaporean identity here for the first time in literature. I don't want to, well, let me say a few things here about the novel itself. It's the story of a young man who is a combination of Dostoevsky's Underground Man, Holden Caulfield from Catcher in the Rye, and James Joyce's Stephen Dedalus from Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, if you can imagine such a thing. One reviewer called it consistently bleak, but I don't think it is. I think actually in many ways it's a very hopeful novel. And one way of seeing that hope is to understand that, to begin with, the novel has quotations from the book of Job at the beginning of each of its three parts. In the end, what Kelvin Tan is saying in this and his second novel is that Singaporeans need to learn a little bit more, and here we perhaps join up with Edouard Glissant. They need to learn a little bit more about making something of suffering and about learning from their own suffering, that through suffering, not through prosperity, not through gain, not even through security, comes identity. And this and his next novel, which has a title that's almost unpronounceable, at least in the way that it's written, the Nether R with parentheses around the R of nether, and the use of the Tamil word nete, which means true, as a kind of pun in the title. And the protagonist's name is not Brinsley, Bivouac. Brinsley probably refers to a 1970s English rock band that never got off the ground. And Bivouac, you know, to set up contemporary camp, that describes his situation very well. And his second protagonist is named Rambo Liu. Rambo spelled as in Arthur Rimbaud, the French poet and author of A Season in Hell. I want to close by mentioning something very interesting. My Singaporean students were very much interested in things American. And I learned not to use my perfectly good British accent, which had been urged upon me by people who had taught there before. One day when a student came into my classroom, she was actually the niece of Edwin Tumbu, and said, Professor Dupree, you're American, aren't you? And I said, yes, I am. She said, but you have such a strong British accent. I said, oh no, I have a perfectly good American accent. She said, would you please use it? We're not so fond of the British. We like the Americans. And I should have looked around the classroom. There were James Dean posters. And in fact, America was what Singapore was looking to, both literarily and musically, generally, as a place that had achieved the kind of popular identity that the country itself needed to develop if it was to have a future. So thank you very much.
I'm wondering, is it possible that Singapore at a future date sort of ceases to be Singaporean and becomes Chinese again? In other words, given how small it is, given how economically influential China will continue to be, given Chinese are the majority of the Singaporean population, is there a possibility that Chinese identification will grow and you know, because
And displace English?
well, because it seems to me that it's hard to imagine a nation in which cabin fever is the national trait. I mean, that seems to me,
Right.
your culture is the desire to get out of where you are.
Yeah.
It seems
Well,
paradoxical.
in All Broken Up in Dancing, the narrators, or the protagonist really, his friends, many of them leave. They leave, and he goes to visit one of them, one of his closest friends who is now living in London and has a good position and all of this. And when he arrives in London for the first time, he looks around and all he sees is Asians. So what I like about Kelvin and his character Brinsley is that, as Kelvin himself has said in an interview, he said, I'm not Chinese, I'm Singaporean. He said, I don't want to leave. He says, this is where I am meaningful as a writer. This is where I want to be. So I don't think that will happen, as a matter of fact. But also I think that Singapore has not yet become a mature nation in any real sense. It is still in its adolescence. And it will be very interesting to see what happens with these young people who were so attracted to what they were reading in Kelvin Tan's underground novel. Kelvin himself is very retiring, except when he's playing with his rock band, which was one of the first examples of a native Singaporean rock band that wrote its own music and worked out its own style. So he's a double threat man. And I've never felt threatened by him. He's a very nice fellow.
Milton Tan's work sounds like an instance of the adoption of a world style.
Yes.
In order to discover what one's national identity.
Oh, very much, yeah. And throughout the novel, Brinsley, the breakthroughs come from Brinsley when he first gets a Jimi Hendrix cassette, A, and B, when he looks over at one of his classmates who's reading a poem that he identifies. He hasn't been interested in literature up to this time. He glimpses a poem that his classmate is reading that he identifies with immediately, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. So what I think is going on there is that they are drawing on the world's resources to find themselves. See, this is an internationalism that's very different from other kinds of internationalism. They don't have, when Edwin Tumbu figured out how to be a Yeats by not imitating Yeats, but by doing what Yeats did in Ireland, in Singapore, then something got moving. And Singaporeans understood right away, I think, that this was something they had to do. But poor Kelvin, he's, maybe he'll be rediscovered. His style is quite difficult. When I said he's more like James Joyce than W.B. Yeats, I should have added he's more like the Joyce of Ulysses than the Joyce of Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. I myself have to concentrate very hard in reading these novels because they're tricky and they do have these multiple points of view that shift even in the middle of a paragraph sometimes. You're going along and suddenly the protagonist is being addressed as you instead of being described in the third person. This shifting, I think, is perfectly deliberate. It's not because he's a poor craftsman, but he's doing it on purpose. Anybody else have any questions about this peculiar and interesting place?
And now we have a short response from local color, someone not from the University of Dallas in any way. Professor James Matthew Wilson is Assistant Professor of Humanities and Augustinian Traditions here at Villanova. He did his BA at the University of Michigan and has an MFA and PhD from the University of Notre Dame. He's recently published a book, 4 Verse Letters, and he's working on a manuscript on T.S. Eliot, Jacques Maritain, and the recovery of the real. James?
It's probably unnecessary to correct the title for a book that doesn't exist yet, but it's Return to the Real. Last night Mark misheard me and thought it was Return to the Will. I thought it was going to be advocating some sort of neo-Nietzschean triumph, which in the context of discussing nationalism or nation and literature probably is not a pleasant association. During Dr. Dupree's talk, I was reminded of two things. At the tail end there, I was reminded of the Irish novel, The Commitments, which is one of the first novels to represent the working class urban Irish. They had always been pushed to the margins of Irish literature because the real Ireland, as one of the fellows I'll be talking about in just a few minutes said, the real Ireland is rural Ireland. It's the Ireland of the land. But one of the things that irritates me about that novel and makes it hard for me to teach is what it more or less says is this, that the working class of Ireland have emerged just in time to be like everybody else. And for many people in Ireland, maybe being just like everybody else is a desirable alternative to being Irish. There's something that comes along with being Irish that involves self-loathing, especially after 1925, and I'll actually refer to that briefly in a few minutes. But I want to offer for general reflection an experience I had a couple years ago teaching the Great Book Seminar here at Villanova. I was teaching my students Dante's Inferno, and we had reached the last day of the Inferno before moving on to greener pastures, and we paused at the Ugolino cantos, the ninth circle of hell, which I'm forgetting the precise order, but it's those who betray family, those who betray city or country, and I forget the third category, but Judas is there, right? Those who betray God. I feel as though I'm missing one, but we'll stick with that. The important details I've said, because in teaching these cantos, for one of the first times in my teaching career, I was brought up absolutely short. You never know what sort of questions students are going to ask on a given day, but this one really surprised me. What they couldn't understand was how Dante could put betrayal of the family farther up and out away from the lowest pits of hell than betrayal to the city. I asked, why not? And of course, my first response was, this is the ninth circle of hell we're talking about. So you're really splitting hairs. But I probed the question, well, why would this be remarkable to you? And the student said, well, your city, your country, that's just where you happen to be born, but your family is, and I think they may have even said eternal. I got that same response, the family is eternal, again, actually this semester in teaching another course. That use of language, I think, is revealing. The family, a natural institution, having an attribute that we pretty much know could not possibly apply to it. Eternal, changeless, permanent. Not permanent generation to generation, but utterly permanent, immutable. That strikes me as a word that seems only applicable to something in a theological context, and not in a natural context. This leads me to my main point for today. Well, let me say this first. One of the most distinguished books on the idea of nationhood is Benedict Anderson's famous study, Imagined Communities, which I think was published first in 1980. And there Anderson says that one of his great disappointments, and indeed the disappointment of many Marxist scholars of nationalism, such as himself, has been that there's never been an account of the nation and nationalism from the actual supporters of these things, what they would think of as a right wing, that's been critically compelling. There are compelling Marxist accounts of the nation, but not from those who would actually believe that the nation is something other than false consciousness or an ideology. My response to that would be that that's precisely because no account of the nation can be furnished if the terms of what constitutes rational debate are cultural, historical materialism. So there's no way you could provide a Marxist account of the nation. That's still an account of the nation as a nation would understand itself. There have been attempts to do something like that. The Irish studies scholar David Lloyd has published an essay called Nationalisms Against the State, where he very generously says nationalism's okay if it angers, gets people riled up against the domination of a bourgeois state and can be harnessed to overthrow it. But then you have to get rid of nationalism for class consciousness. Well, what I would want to suggest is the reason that you can't provide an account of the nation in materialist terms isn't just because for the Marxist materialist or for the materialist of any stripe, the nation is some kind of epiphenomenon or ideology. It's a deeper problem than that that's not particular just to Marxism. And I would articulate it in these terms, that actually all of our literary and all of our cultural debates are actually just the continuations of theological arguments, but in different contexts and in different terms, and in contexts and in terms that don't really admit of ready clarification. And so when we look at cultural studies scholarship, when we look at literary scholarship, we usually see some kind of theology emerging just without the theos. We find the advocates of a sort of materialist nominalism, the literary scholar who says, well, only the material is real, words aren't exactly material, we're not sure what to do with that, so we'll say, well, they're an epiphenomenon packed upon matter, and therefore expressive of something, though not themselves significant. Then there's the Stoic cosmopolitan view, which says, well, right, sure. Language and most aspects of particular life are philosophically indefensible, as Martha Nussbaum would put it, or unreal, but there is some kind of absolute that if we peel away layers of whatever it is that we're calling the particular, the parochial, the purblind, the delusional, eventually we'll get to some kind of absolute, which reminds me of a passage from Wallace Stevens' Notes Towards a Supreme Fiction, where he says, we peel away every fiction but one, the fiction of an absolute. So in the name of this fiction, we try to get at some sort of absolute condition. This usually masquerades as some kind of call for world consciousness or global citizenship, so on and so forth, but what it usually seems to serve to do is just make people sufficiently detached from everything they know that they are more pliable and malleable for some kind of usually technocratic, what would you say, reformatting. Forgive the software metaphor there. And then there's a combination of the two, which we heard discussed briefly with Edouard Glissant, the dialectic, the attempt to recover the material and the particular, and to put it into intellectual play with something universal and absolute. And of course, Hegel is the origin of this par excellence. What the dialectical tries to do, I think, is it tries to preserve the particular, to give it meaning. But of course, it only has meaning insofar as it shows forth some partial realization of totality. Now, when Hegel reconceived totality not as God, but as philosophy, or maybe I should say not as theology, but as philosophy, he knew what he was doing. But when he did that, I think he made it very hard for us, his heirs, to know what we're talking about when we're talking about these things. As in, his notion of a totality is so imminent to history, the end of history, that universality seems to be the end of every particular road, as opposed to the ground of our understanding a particular road. So, why is it that we tend to preserve some kind of dialectic between the particular and the universal, however unsatisfactory our efforts to do that have been? I would propose that we do it because we have trouble understanding our own culture, and we don't understand our own culture, or the nature of culture, because we don't really understand ourselves, and we have trouble understanding ourselves because we find it impossible to ask questions about God. So here's my argument that cultural debates, literary debates, are just theology under a different sign. Hannah Arendt herself, no Christian to be sure, said that human beings really can't ask questions about their nature without asking questions about God. And so I want to propose that when Aristotle defined man as a political animal and as a rational animal, that was actually a fundamental theological insight. You can hear I'm using theology, therefore, in a very broad sense, but I think a sense that isn't eviscerated of specific content. Man is a political animal, man is a rational animal. Man as a human as a creature who knows reality only in the language of a tradition and a community, but who, in knowing reality, or knowing all things through a particular language in a particular community, is capable of knowing things beyond that language and community. He is political intrinsically and also rational. His mind uses the code of language, but it also looks out onto the unconditioned code of truth. Now, for centuries, dare I say millennia, this is something that literature has always claimed to do. It has spoken to the particular, and it's spoken to the universal. So when we turn to another Yale scholar other than these two here, to W.K. Wimsatt in 1953, we get an essay called The Concrete Universal, which of course takes its title, unfortunately, from Hegel, but gets at something very clever. Literature speaks to that which is both concrete, and it speaks to the universal through the concrete. I want to give two brief instances of two fellows I would call literary nationalists, who are nationalists in their literary sensibility precisely because they sensed the insight that Wimsatt expresses for us in terms of the concrete universal. The first one is a fellow, Daniel Corkery, who has not fared well in the estimation of his Irish countrymen. Corkery was one of the leading critics and writers of short stories in the period immediately preceding and immediately following Irish independence, so roughly 1919 to 1935 or so. He wrote one of the most provocative works of Irish literary criticism, Sing in Anglo-Irish Literature, where he argued that all Anglo-Irish literature was not really Irish literature. It was the product of a sort of dual consciousness. He didn't express it in such psychoanalytic terms. He said they're stuck between two stools. More Irish bar stool terminology seems more fitting. And he also was one of the authors of one of the first serious works of cultural history, The Hidden Ireland, which went through the archives and looked at the Celtic literature, the Irish language literature of the 18th century, to recover an image of what Ireland was like during this period where other historians had only looked at the English language resources. All of this was part of a project that Corkery called explicitly Romantic, as opposed to Renaissance. The Renaissance spirit was one of second-rate Hellenism, he said. Any culture that was infected with the spirit of the Renaissance was a culture that was trying to be Greece, and merely trying to be Greece, as in to replicate the glory that was Athens. The Romantic tradition was one that looked to the intrinsic life of a people and tried to represent it accurately and adequately. Now, contrary to popular prejudice about, well, both Corkery and literary nationalists in general, following on Dr. Cowan's comments earlier today about Glissant, Corkery looked quite explicitly for his models of literary nationalism to the 19th century Russians, to Walt Whitman and the Americans, and also to the Greeks. He didn't want to be a Renaissance Greek. He wanted to look at the life of the Greeks and see how they represented their own life, and to do that in an Irish context. In Sing in Anglo-Irish Literature, Corkery said there are three attributes that constitute authentic Irish literature. A true Irish author, as opposed to an Anglo-Irish author, will foreground the land, national consciousness, and religion. By religion, of course, he means Catholicism. Now, what this sounds like is a project of national literature as mere natural or national self-expression. But actually, under the category religion, he says this is what is most universal about Irish culture. This is the ground of meaning that the whole world can appreciate, beyond just the Irish who will find something familiar in his pages or the pages of other authentically Irish authors. Another fellow I'd like to mention is Thomas McGreevy, who's often quoted favorably in comparison with Corkery. Corkery is dismissed as a nationalist and a crank, and he was definitely a crank, but maybe not to be dismissed thus. McGreevy tends to be looked upon more favorably, and there's in fact growing interest in his work, even in Ireland at the present moment. And yet McGreevy repeats a lot of the same moves as Corkery, and he just does it with a little more finesse. Like Corkery, McGreevy says all art expresses national consciousness. And a reader goes to a work of literature to find that consciousness expressed. So there's this conception of the particular national self-expression. But is Ireland worth representing, asked McGreevy? And note, McGreevy was not capable of the sort of self-loathing typical of many of his countrymen, so he was asking this question quite seriously. He said, well, there is a permanent part of Ireland. That's worth expressing in literature. And he defined the permanent part of Ireland in terms of the transcendentals, the true, the good, and the beautiful, which, and here's my, since this is Villanova, this is an inevitable nod. He referred to this in the words of St. Augustine as the kingdom of God. So the purpose of literature is to express the nation, which is supposed to express what can't be the nation, the city of man, the city of God. So there's some conception that by representing the particular, the nation, that the universal will shine through. This notion of a universal cannot be the totality of Hegel, which is some sort of intra-historical end of history. It brings an end to all our journeys, and so ultimately we'll all be found whole. It's rather a recognition of something that most of us know already, and that is that we discover truth living particular and individuated lives. This notion seemed threatened to these literary nationalists, and so it was in defense of the idea of a national literature that they were also able to defend the idea of literature as a species of truth. What kind of species of truth? Here's my, I'm getting to my conclusion. A species of truth that we would understand theologically as incarnation. The universal or the absolute present in the particular and the individual. Now our talks today, I think, have all given us, I think, a very rich sense of the necessity and the value of this incarnational approach to the literary. I think the Council of National Literatures, with its effort not to fall into that, I like the choice Welleck phrase of the sentimental cosmopolitanism, its unwillingness to say that there could be such a subject as comparative literature, there's merely the act of comparing literature, preserves in its integrity the particular, while also recognizing that when one engages in the exercise of comparing two disparate or different traditions, that one's not merely engaged in a fruitless exercise of incommensurability, where you say, in the end, wow, I really don't understand you. A sense that somehow we're getting at reality when we discuss, when we, in the reading and the writing of literature, that we're somehow getting at reality. But that's not a reality that's easily expressed as a national program. The abyss of being was the phrase you used. Being a Thomist, I would phrase it differently, but I think the abyss of being is a very signifying word here. It's entering into a kind of reality, but it's a reality that I think Glissant's, as it were, scholarly sources maybe deprived him the vocabulary to express in more positive terms. And I don't mean positive as in upbeat, I mean as in ontologically substantive. And then finally, with Dr. Dupree's account of the rise of Singapore, I think it was a wonderful reminder. I wish my students in the Dante course could have been here today to remind us that asking these questions about the nature of our community and the nature of the language, the particular local language that we speak in order to know the unconditioned and absolute truth, is not a project to be either dismissed as irrelevant or as merely contingent, but is actually a project for which many people's hearts burn, especially when they are aware that they don't have it yet. Okay, so thank you.
And do you want to come up and say a few words?
Can I say something?
Yes, please.
I think Professor Wilson has touched on things that we cannot go into, obviously, at this point, but things that are real in the context of our subject, theological, religious, philosophical forces that are always at work in anything of this kind that we're talking about. Having said that, let me go back and underscore some of the things that we have to remember about what we heard today, because those were two excellent papers, each one doing the kind of thing that the Council has been doing for 40 years through the series and panels at many conferences, not just the MLA, regional MLAs, but often invited by universities to discuss the subject and so on. So we have a lot of experience in this, and I have to say that howsoever we define the national element in this subject, it is very real, especially to the writers, as our two speakers have made very, very clear. And there isn't a place in the world where people are writing where the writer does not identify himself with his country or whatever nation happens to be his. I don't think there's a single one. And by the way, let me say parenthetically that very often the writers who get the Nobel Prize, the international writers, as someone remarked, and I think it's very true, they're not necessarily representative of the national culture they come from. They're not the best measure of that national literature. I guess Ibsen is one of the exceptions. I had a lot of trouble with Ibsen when we did the Norway issue. I was in Australia at the time, and I got this long 10-page letter from the person who was the special editor working with me, and we were communicating across. In those days, there was no email. So anyway, we were communicating, and he wrote me this long letter, and he said, what do we do about Ibsen? Really long letter, and discussing the entire contents of the book, which was fine, because that's the kind of work that went into the book, working with the special editor before we even approached potential writers of the articles. So that we always had an outline for the overview, which made the book very special, each one. Anyway, at one point he said, what do we do about Ibsen? He overwhelms, obviously. He's an international writer. He overwhelms the scene. And I had to think about it, and finally I got back to him and said, and he was especially concerned about the dramatists in Norway, that he overwhelms everyone else. Still, we couldn't get rid of him. He belongs somewhere in there. So I came up with the idea, let's find someone to write an article on the influence of Ibsen on other Norwegian dramatists. And it worked very well. Forget about his international reputation. But what I want to underscore here, and the example of Singapore was a very good one. Here's a small area, and yet very much aware of itself. And the writers, as you pointed out very well, the writers are very eager to associate themselves as Singaporeans. At the same time, you described exactly the kind of problem that we have faced in every country, especially us in the United States, with the hyphenated American. I am one. I think many people in this group probably are hyphenated Americans, right? Well, the Singapores too are hyphenated in that sense. I don't know what the resolution to that is, because it's very, very hard. Hegel, since he mentions Hegel, talks about it and says how he talked about America and how difficult it would be. And I think Badgett also had something to say on this, how difficult it would be to find a solution that would really make these countries that have so many immigrants who have become hyphenated Americans, have them become wholeheartedly, let's say, American. Eliot is such good reading. His essays are marvelous. If you haven't read anything of T.S. Eliot, please do, those of you in the audience. And if you read a lot of him, you'll realize he knew Hegel but didn't want to admit it. But he writes in that wonderful way where he makes the opposite also true. Have you noticed that? He's one of the few people. Bradley does it, Eliot does it, Dorothy Sayers does it, when she writes about Dante. I haven't met any other writer who does that. He gets away with murder. You know, in one essay, the one on Hamlet, at one point, are you listening? At one point he says, Hamlet is the Mona Lisa of literature. Wow, that's great praise, right? In the next sentence he says, it is an artistic failure. Now, you know, it's laughable, but it's not. That's absolutely out of Hegel. When Hegel says art transcends itself, he is talking about moments in history where the literature sort of overflowed the parameters, the definition. Think of modern art. He was talking about things like that. When he says art transcends itself, what he means is that the art has reached a point where it becomes something else. All literature today is tending toward what Eliot calls the first voice of poetry, of literature, which is poetry. It's all tending that way. When you think of James Joyce and the novel, it's all tending that way. Anyway, but that's something else. This is another story. But I thought I would mention these things because they are interesting in the evolution of a literature. But what I liked especially was the way in which the particulars were given to us about these things. I mean, we learned a great deal about the literature of Singapore, writers in Singapore, and I was thinking to myself, and it could be done tomorrow, anyone who has the energy, you know, there are courses in world literature, but most of them are very limited as to what they offer. And the Norton Anthology, you remember, was taken to task many times by other editors and people in literature because their series always was primarily Western. It wasn't really world literature. Well, why can't we make it that? Think of a course like the novel in world literature. Ivo Andrich, Barbara Boynton from Australia, right? Rao from India. Of course, you include American and you include some, you know, classic British. But in that context, comparisons always make for sharper vision. Keep that in mind. If they're superficial, of course, it's not going to work. But comparisons, when you know a subject well and you bring it to bear on something else, it's going to work 5 times better for you on either end. And I think that's something you have to keep in mind. So comparative studies is still a wide open field in terms of world literature. Or you can do the same thing with poetry. You know, world poetry, the literature of poetry in the world, or whatever. And anyone who knows or takes the time to read some of these things, and it doesn't take much time. When I was in Australia, they were sending me all kinds of books. I think I read every novel that was ever published in Australia. Wonderful reading, let me tell you, wonderful reading. The same is true of the English novels in India. Wonderful reading. And there, as I mentioned earlier, you have a cluster ready-made for any teaching, anybody who wants to take it on. The cluster of the former Commonwealth literatures. In other words, you can find writers in Australia, in Canada, in Singapore, in India, and create a cluster in English without translation, because that's a problem. Once you get into the wider spectrum, and we have had to do it, but I always said, I want no translations for these volumes. I want the few experts who exist. We call on them to write the articles that we offer them. And that's the way we did it. Because I'm a translator, but I know what a grueling task and a thankless task it is, and yet very necessary. And when you get into the wider aspect of all this, you have to have translations. You can't go without translations if you're going to go into the literature of the Far East, for example. And that presents a problem all by itself, because the ideograms of Chinese and the language, what's happening with the language in China, in other places, all that impacts on this. How do we get the works we want into English and into the classrooms? And it's really, but we don't have to face that now. As I said, there are steps along the way that are much easier and very possible. The potential is there, the possibilities are there. If you look at the directory of even ISI, the membership, you'll find colleagues who are interested in these things, and maybe you should be communicating with them and asking them to lecture, give a lecture, or join you in a panel. You can create panels at the MLA. We used to have them. I've stopped doing it because I'm out of circulation right now in terms of academic. I'm doing a lot of editing and writing, but not that. Anyway, and so the national literatures, of course, politics always comes into it. Politics always has a bearing. In Africa, it was very clear. The Pan-African writers wanted to write about the political, and they did. And then you had, and there was a little friction always there because it became a debate. And there were African writers who wanted to write, because, especially because of all the colonies in Africa, wanted to write in the other vein. Forget about all that. We want to write about the situation here. We're not interested in the politics. And that became a real debate. I don't know, I've forgotten, I was looking at it to see how we handled it in the volume. I don't think we really did, but there are a lot of things there that contribute to it. And you can find, that's a very good volume, by the way. I said Black Africa because there are so many other African possibilities that can be done, the colonial African and so on. We had to always plan the volume so that it was doable in a certain way, and that was it. So, in spite of the need for translations, which will come later, I think, in this evolution, there is still a great deal that can be done even tomorrow. And I think what you have to take away with you from this conference is the possibility of doing something on your campus in terms of the things that interest you and how they can be introduced into the existing canon in some way. And it can be done. You'll need the administration to help you out. But I think if it's done slowly and with discretion, it can be done. And then students will have a much wider vision of certain things. I mean, what you had to say about Singapore is extremely important, I think, and your argument also. And they deserve to be heard. They deserve in a wider context. And we have to produce that context. It's not there for us, it's not waiting for us. And that's why it was very hard work uphill. I remember when I even first used the word literatures in the plural, back in the 70s, I was getting flack all over the place. What do you mean, literatures? Can you imagine that? Can you imagine that today? So that's what we faced, and a lot of that, of course, with the global mandate, a lot of that has been, destroyed, has been answered. But, so I'm reminded also, Professor Wilson mentioned the concrete and the universal, which of course exist in every work. But again, T.S. Eliot has a wonderful phrase. I think it's on the essay about American literature, a literature that has two literatures in the same language. We've never really addressed that, but in a talk he gave, which became an essay, American literature and something, I've forgotten the title. He says that the sign of greatness in a new work of literature is strong local flavor and universality. He had something else, something universal, I forgot what the word is, but that's the essence of it, what you were saying before. And I think you have to weigh, because a lot of this is new stuff, and you say, well, which ones will we choose to replace this or that in this course or that course? Well, always think of that definition. In other words, Rao, Waiting for the Mahatma, it's in English, but it has its own flavor. There's no novel in English that resembles that one. It's Indian, absolutely Indian, and of course it's an Indian subject. But and his novels are all like that, wonderfully readable. It's like a feast, an international food fest, you know, except that this is a lit fest. So that's what we're after. We're trying to make the global mandate that has been handed down to us for years now a reality in literary studies. And I hope you carry away some of these things today. Thank you.